Welcome back! My name is ballerscuba. This is Video Games Over Time. We are still in 1982, and today we're going to talk about Conan the Barbarian. Conan the Barbarian is the creation of Robert E. Howard. Born in 1906, Robert E. Howard had been struggling to make a career as a writer in the 1920s. What stories he was able to publish were typically short horror stories and were often published in Weird Tales, a fantasy and horror pulp fiction magazine. One of Howard's earlier published stories was Red Shadows, which was published in 1928. This story introduces the character of Solomon Kane, an English Puritan who vanquishes evil wherever he finds it. The character of Solomon Kane became popular, so Howard wrote several more stories with the character. In total, Weird Tales would publish 7 stories featuring Solomon Kane between 1928 and 1932. The publication of Red Shadows is often seen as the beginning of the sword and sorcery genre. Sword and sorcery is a subgenre of fantasy literature that was first named in 1961. Sword and sorcery stories typically feature a sword-wielding hero, romance, magic, and the supernatural. The stories typically follow the hero through their personal struggles and personal battles. One of the turning points in Robert E. Howard's career was the publication of the short story The Shadow Kingdom. Howard had written the story originally in 1927, but it was rejected until it was rewritten a couple years later. Weird Tales published The Shadow Kingdom in August 1929. The Shadow Kingdom is a story that introduces Kull, a barbarian from Atlantis, who struggles against prehistoric serpent men. This became the first story in Howard's sword and sorcery universe. Howard would receive $100 for the story, the most he had ever received for a story. Inspired by the success, Howard would write several more stories featuring Kull, although Weird Tales would only publish 2 of those stories. So Howard moved on to other characters and other stories. Howard would publish several ghost stories, as well as several boxing stories, including popular boxing stories featuring Sailor Steve Costigan. His Sailor Steve Costigan stories became so popular that Howard would quit college and start focusing on writing full-time. It was during this time that Howard became interested in H.P. Lovecraft's stories. Lovecraft was a writer of weird and horror fiction, most widely known for his Cthulhu mythos. The 2 men formed a friendship, and Howard would join what would be known as the Lovecraft Circle, a group of writers and friends of H.P. Lovecraft. That friendship would have a noticeable impact on Howard's writing. In 1932, while in southern Texas, Robert E. Howard would conceive of his most famous character, Conan. Howard had used this name for a similar character in a previous story published in 1931, but that character is seen more of a prototype to the more famous Conan. Howard began fleshing out a world for his new character. This would become known as the Hyborian Age. The Hyborian Age is a fictional period in Earth's distant past, between the sinking of Atlantis and the earliest recorded history of humans. Howard reworked an unpublished story featuring Kull and transformed it into a story featuring Conan. This would become The Phoenix on the Sword. Howard would immediately write 2 more stories featuring Conan before sending the stories to Weird Tales. The stories were initially rejected, but the editor saw promise in them. Howard would not abandon this character as he had the others, and continued to work and rework the stories and the world. This work would pay off, as Weird Tales would publish their first Conan story, The Phoenix on the Sword, in December 1932. By that time, Howard had already written 9 Conan stories. The character would prove very popular. Between 1933 and 1936, Weird Tales would publish 17 stories with the character. Howard would be contacted with the prospects of a novel for Conan. Howard would then write The Hour of the Dragon, a full novel about Conan, but the interested publisher would be unable to publish it due to financial reasons. The novel would be published as a serial in Weird Tales across 5 months, starting in December 1935. It was around this time that Howard seemed to lose interest in the character. The Conan stories started having more of a Western story template to them. Howard also began publishing stories in several other genres, eventually devoting almost all his time to writing Western stories. Drastic changes were happening in Howard's life. Weird Tales had fallen behind on their payments to Howard. His friends had gotten married, his girlfriend left him to go to graduate school, and his mother was suffering from tuberculosis. When his mother entered a coma due to the disease, Robert asked the nurse if she would ever get out of it. He was told she would not, and this was it. Robert E. Howard committed suicide on June 11, 1936. He was 30 years old. With Howard's death, the copyright for Conan the Barbarian passed through several people. In total, Howard had written 21 completed Conan stories, 17 of which had been published, as well as several other story fragments. These stories would eventually fall into the hands of L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter. These writers would help relaunch the character in the 50s and 60s, writing edited, reworked, and rewritten stories featuring the character. Howard's original stories would be out of print for around 40 years. The work of L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter would reignite passion for the characters and the world of Conan. Conan would be featured heavily in comic books as well. Marvel Comics would start publishing Conan the Barbarian in 1970, written by Roy Thomas. Marvel would publish this comic book, featuring original stories, every month from then on. The comic became so popular that Marvel would create a second comic book, named Savage Sword of Conan. This black and white comic was for a more mature audience. Savage Sword of Conan would become one of the most popular comic books of the 70s. Marvel would create additional storylines with a newspaper comic strip, several stories in the Savage Tales series, giant-sized Conan comics, and King Conan comics. Other Howard characters would be featured as well. Kull would be featured in Kull the Conqueror comics from 1971 to 1973, Kull the Destroyer in 1973 through 1975, and Kull and the Barbarians in 1975. Kull the Conqueror would be relaunched in 1982. Howard's Solomon Kane character would also make appearances in 2 individual comic books. Marvel would even create their own sword and sorcery character known as Red Sonja. Red Sonja is based on Red Sonja of Rogatino from a 1934 Howard short story. She was first depicted in a Conan the Barbarian comic, but would get her own comic series from 1977 to 1979. Because of all these comic books, the popularity of Conan the Barbarian and the Hyborian Age was higher than it had ever been before. This popularity would lead to the desire to create a Conan the Barbarian film. The problem was the issue of licensing. At the time, the publisher of the stories was having financial and legal problems that prevented anyone from clearly sorting out who had the rights to the stories, which were held in an injunction. Edward R. Pressman was able to help finalize the issue by paying over $100,000 in legal fees, then was able to get the film rights by paying an additional $7,500. John Milius, an American writer, director, and producer, and Buzz Feitshans, an American producer, approached Pressman in hopes of creating the film. However, negotiations did not go well, and Milius and Feitshans' project did not continue. Pressman was able to get an offer from Paramount Pictures to fund the film's initial $2.5 million budget, as long as an established screenwriter was attached to the film. Pressman was able to recruit Oliver Stone to be the screenwriter. Stone had written Midnight Express, a prison drama that was released in 1978. That was acceptable to Paramount. Pressman also recruited Ron Cobb to establish the initial visuals of the film. Cobb had just finished working on Alien at the time. After a few drawings and paintings, Cobb would leave the project to work on another film. Oliver Stone would then work on the script. There had been an earlier script written with the help of Roy Thomas from Marvel Comics, which was based on one of Robert E. Howard's original stories, but this was abandoned. Oliver Stone has publicly stated that he was under the influence of heavy drugs during this time, but felt his script was an inspired fever dream. The script would take inspiration from two of Robert E. Howard's stories, but would go in a different direction. Instead of taking place in the distant past, Stone's script proposed a 4-hour story in which Conan leads an army in a post-apocalyptic future against 10,000 mutants. Estimates of Stone's script would put the new budget to $40 million. Pressman could not get a studio to fund the project with this new budget. Meanwhile, the search for a director began. It was thought that Stone, along with Joe Alves, the second unit director for Jaws, could co-direct the film, but that did not work. The job was also offered to Ridley Scott, the director of Alien, but he refused. Ron Cobb showed his drawings and Oliver Stone's script to John Milius, who had initially shown interest in the project. Milius decided to offer to direct the film again. Milius had directed both Dirty Harry, a neo-noir action film starring Clint Eastwood, and its sequel, Magnum Force. However, Milius was under contract to direct his next film for producer Dino De Laurentiis. After years of negotiations, Pressman and De Laurentiis agreed to co-produce the film. As part of the agreement, Dino De Laurentiis took over financing for the film, while Pressman agreed to give up all claims to the film's profits. Pressman, however, would retain the rights to approve any changes to the script, cast, and director. John Milius would be formally announced as director in 1979, with Ron Cobb named as the production designer. Universal Studios would sign on to be the film's distributor in North America. They would contribute $17.5 million towards the film's budget and put together $12 million for marketing. When Milius took over as director, he decided to change Oliver Stone's script. He threw out the second half of the script entirely and began reworking the first half. Milius would draw inspiration from some of Howard's original stories, some of the later reworked stories, as well as some Japanese films, especially Akira Kurosawa's 1954 film, Seven Samurai. Even before the rights to the film had been obtained, work began on casting the film. Several actors were considered for Conan, including Charles Bronson and Sylvester Stallone. However, after watching a rough cut of the bodybuilding documentary Pumping Iron, the decision was made to cast Arnold Schwarzenegger in the lead role. Schwarzenegger was given $250,000 initially, under the promise that the bodybuilder would not take any other sword and sorcery roles. While many other roles were filled with novice actors, veteran actors James Earl Jones and Max von Sydow were cast in hopes that they could help inspire the other actors. Schwarzenegger would have to undergo quite the transformation for the role. he would have to undergo a training regimen to slim down and appear more athletic, losing 20 pounds as a result. He would also train with a vocal coach to try to get rid of his thick Austrian accent. It is said that Schwarzenegger would practice his longer speeches over 40 times each before filming. Filming would start in October 1980 and would last until April 1981. It would take place in several countries to get the appearance of a natural prehistoric land. The film would mainly utilize practical effects, relying on the special effects team being on set. Some optical effects were added after the fact as well to add more fantasy elements to the film. John Milius would hire his friend BASIL for the soundtrack. POLEDOURIS was hired before principal photography had started in an attempt to give the composer several attempts to work on the soundtrack. The film was originally supposed to be released in time for Christmas 1981. However, seeing a preliminary version of the film, Universal requested further editing be done. It is said that the film proved to be too violent. The film was trimmed from around 140 minutes to around 129 minutes, 126 minutes for the American release. When the film was completed, the final cost of production was $20 million, over $55 million in 2021. Advertising for the film began early and proved to be effective. Teaser posters started appearing in 1980, before filming had even begun. When the film was shown in sneak previews around the United States in February 1982, there were lines so long that they were blocking traffic. Conan the Barbarian saw its official debut on March 16th in Madrid, Spain. It would be released in 1,400 theaters across America on May 14th, 1982. With the film's release, it's time to talk about the plot of the film. If you have not seen the film and do not want its plot spoiled, now would be the time to stop. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video. For those of you that have stayed, let's talk about the plot of the 1982 Conan the Barbarian film. The film starts with a young Conan watching his father forge a sword. Later, Conan's village is attacked by raiders led by Thulsa Doom, and the children of the village, including Conan, are enslaved. Conan survives, and his master decides to train Conan to be a gladiator. Conan is able to win countless fights as a gladiator and is freed by his master. Chased by wild dogs, Conan finds himself in an Atlantean tomb, where he finds an ancient and powerful sword. Conan then wanders the world with this sword, eventually finding himself in a witch's hut, where he receives a prophecy. He befriends an archer named Subutai, and the two go to the city of Zamora to look for Thulsa Doom, where they meet the pirate Valeria. The three loot the Tower of the Serpent, killing a snake and obtaining the valuable Eye of the Serpent in the process. However, the thieves are eventually caught and brought to King Osric. Osric asks the three to rescue his daughter, Princess Yasmina, from Thulsa Doom. Subutai and Valeria refuse, but Conan agrees. So Conan sets off alone to the Temple of Set. Conan disguises himself as a thief, but is caught. Thulsa Doom has Conan tortured, then orders Conan to be crucified on the Tree of Woe. Conan is close to death when Subutai finds him, and takes Conan to Akira, the Wizard of the Mounds. The wizard summons spirits to heal Conan, but warns that this will take a heavy toll. Valeria says she is willing to pay the toll. The spirits try to abduct Conan, but Subutai and Valeria fight them off. Subutai and Valeria then agree to join Conan on his quest. The three infiltrate the Temple of Set. They are able to rescue the princess, but Conan is unable to fight Thulsa Doom, who transformed into a snake and slithered away. Valeria is mortally wounded by a stiffened snake shot like an arrow in the fight and dies, paying the toll that was foretold. Conan then prepares for battle against Thulsa Doom at the mound. When the army comes, Conan and his party are able to fend off Thulsa Doom's army. Conan does come into danger by Thulsa Doom's lieutenant, but is saved by Valeria, who returns as a Valkyrie. Thulsa Doom tries to shoot the princess, but the shot is blocked, and Thulsa Doom retreats to the temple. Conan is able to recover his father's sword during the battle. Conan sneaks back into the temple and confronts Thulsa Doom. Thulsa Doom tries to mesmerize Conan, but Conan is able to resist. Conan uses his father's sword to decapitate Thulsa Doom. He then burns the temple and returns Princess Yasmina to King Osric. Finally, we get a glimpse into the future, when Conan is able to become king. When Conan the Barbarian debuted, the film became the highest grossing film on its opening weekend, making over $9.4 million that weekend, over $26.4 million in 2021. Overall, the film would gross somewhere between $68.9 million and $79.1 million worldwide, becoming a success for all companies involved, although the film did not qualify as a blockbuster. Critics at the time had mixed opinions on the film. Some aspects of the film were seen as positive by some critics, while those same features were seen as negative by other critics. The violence and action were received with mixed opinions, as well as the film's adherence to the source material. Arnold Schwarzenegger's performance also received mixed reviews, with his physicality being seen as a highlight, but his acting and dialogue not reaching the standard that the critics wanted. The one thing that seemed to be agreed upon at the time was that the soundtrack to the film was good. As time has gone on, the film has been received better by critics. The film does remain a cult classic among the audience. The film ultimately brought the character that had remained in the background for nearly 50 years to the forefront of public consciousness. The idea of a sword-wielding barbarian out to seek revenge would become an idea that was copied again and again. That is the story of Conan the Barbarian up to 1982. Looking ahead, we will continue to hear about the character of Conan in the future, as stories surrounding the character would continue to be told. We will also be hearing about the film's star, Arnold Schwarzenegger, again, as his iconic performance would help him land further film roles. The film's creators would, of course, continue to create films over the years. Don't be surprised to hear those names again in the future as well. And that will do it for the story of Conan the Barbarian for now. My name is ballerscuba. This has been Video Games Over Time. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in our next video when we take things underground.